Thomas Mitchell sat in the back row of the small claims court, his weathered hands clutching a manila folder that contained what remained of his dignity. At 72, his once proud military bearing had been worn down by years of bureaucratic battles and financial struggles. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his lined face, highlighting the deep furrows that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning chaos of small claims proceedings. People shuffled papers, whispered to their companions, and checked their phones while waiting for their cases to be called. Thomas had been sitting there since the court opened at 8 in the morning, even though his case wasn't scheduled until 11. He couldn't afford to be late, not when everything depended on this moment. Inside the manila folder were photocopies of documents that represented 40 years of his life. His discharge papers from Vietnam, medical records detailing injuries sustained in combat, and, most importantly, the documentation for 3 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a Medal of Valor that he had earned during his 2 tours of duty in Southeast Asia. These weren't just pieces of paper to Thomas. They were proof that he had served his country with honor, that he had bled for freedom, and that he deserved the disability benefits that the Veterans Administration had been denying him for the past 3 years. The trouble had started when Thomas applied for an increase in his disability rating. His arthritis had worsened considerably, a direct result of injuries sustained when his unit had been ambushed near Da Nang in 1968. Shrapnel had torn through his left shoulder and hip, leaving him with permanent damage that grew more painful with each passing year. At 72, simple tasks like opening a jar or climbing stairs had become monumental challenges. When he submitted his application for increased benefits, complete with medical documentation from 3 different doctors, the VA had responded with a letter that changed his world. They claimed there was no record of his medals in their system. According to their files, Thomas Mitchell had served in Vietnam, but there was no documentation of the heroic actions that had earned him his decorations. Without proof of his combat-related injuries, they argued, he wasn't entitled to the disability compensation he was seeking. Thomas had spent months trying to resolve the issue through proper channels. He had written letters, made phone calls, and even driven the 2 hours to the nearest VA office to speak with someone in person. Each time, he was told the same thing. Without official documentation of his medals, there was no way to verify his claims about combat injuries. The bureaucrats spoke to him with the kind of polite indifference reserved for people they considered to be frauds or troublemakers. The final straw had come when a young VA administrator, barely old enough to have served in Afghanistan, had suggested that Thomas might be suffering from age-related memory issues. The implication was clear. They thought he was either lying about his service or genuinely confused about what had happened to him 40 years earlier. That accusation had cut deeper than any enemy bullet ever had. Unable to afford a lawyer and running out of options, Thomas had filed a small claims case against the Veterans Administration. He wasn't asking for money beyond what he was legally entitled to receive. He simply wanted them to acknowledge his service, to recognize the sacrifices he had made, and to provide the benefits that Congress had promised to veterans like him. It was a David and Goliath battle, and Thomas knew the odds were stacked against him. As he sat in the courtroom that morning, Thomas thought about the men he had served with in Vietnam. Most of them were gone now, victims of Agent Orange exposure, suicide, or simply the passage of time. Those who remained were scattered across the country, fighting their own battles with an indifferent bureaucracy that seemed to view veterans as problems to be managed rather than heroes to be honored. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that he was spending his golden years fighting the same government he had risked his life to defend. He remembered the day he had volunteered for a second tour in Vietnam, driven by a sense of duty and a belief that his country would take care of him when his service was complete. That young soldier could never have imagined that 5 decades later, he would be sitting in a courtroom, begging for recognition of sacrifices that had already cost him so much. At 10:30, a bailiff called for order as Judge Harold Morrison took the bench. Morrison was in his early 50s, with the kind of perfectly groomed appearance that suggested he had never experienced real hardship. His black robes seemed to emphasize his authority, and When he spoke, it was with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to having his words carry weight. The judge quickly dispatched the first several cases on the docket, showing little patience for what he clearly considered to be minor disputes between unreasonable people. A tenant complaining about a security deposit received a lecture about personal responsibility. A consumer seeking a refund for a defective product was told that buyer's remorse wasn't grounds for legal action. Morrison's message was clear. His courtroom was not a place for people to air their petty grievances. When Thomas's case was finally called, he walked slowly to the plaintiff's table, his hip protesting with each step. The defendant's table remained empty. The Veterans Administration had sent no representative to court, apparently confident that the case would be dismissed without their input. Thomas placed his manila folder on the table and stood as straight as his old injuries would allow. Judge Morrison barely glanced up from his paperwork as he reviewed the case file. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a tone of barely concealed irritation, "you're here claiming that the Veterans Administration owes you disability benefits based on medals that they say you never received. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam and was wounded multiple times in combat. I have the documentation right here." Morrison held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Mitchell, I've reviewed your file, and, frankly, I'm troubled by what I see here. You're asking this court to override the determination of the Veterans Administration, an agency with access to comprehensive military records, based on what appears to be photocopied documents that could have been created by anyone with access to a computer." Thomas felt his heart sink, but he pressed on. "Your Honor, these are copies of my original discharge papers and medal citations. The originals were lost in a house fire 3 years ago, but I can provide sworn statement from men who served with me." "Mr. Mitchell," the judge interrupted again, his tone growing colder. "This court sees cases like this more often than you might think. Veterans who believe they're entitled to benefits based on claimed service that can't be documented. The sad reality is that some people, particularly as they age, begin to confuse movies they've seen or stories they've heard with their own experiences." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. The judge was essentially calling him a liar or suggesting he was suffering from dementia. Around the courtroom, people had stopped their quiet conversations to listen to the proceedings. Thomas could feel their eyes on him, and he wondered if they saw him the way the judge apparently did, as a confused old man making up stories about a war that had ended before some of them were born. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice beginning to shake with emotion, "I would never dishonor the memory of the men I served with by fabricating stories about my service. These medals represent real actions, real sacrifices. Men died earning recognition that this court is now suggesting never existed." Judge Morrison's expression hardened further. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand that you may believe these events occurred, but belief is not evidence. The Veterans Administration has stated clearly that there is no record of the medals you claim to have received. Without official documentation, this court cannot and will not order a federal agency to provide benefits based solely on your assertions." Thomas opened his manila folder with trembling hands. "Your Honor, please, if you would just look at these documents. My commanding officer wrote detailed reports about the actions that earned these medals. The Bronze Star citation specifically mentions Mr. Mitchell," Morrison said sharply. "I've seen enough. These photocopied documents prove nothing. Anyone with basic computer skills could create similar paperwork. What troubles me most is that you're taking up this court's valuable time with what amounts to an elaborate fraud." The word fraud hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as the full implication of the judge's words sank in. Not only was Morrison denying his claim, but he was suggesting that Thomas was deliberately attempting to defraud the government. The accusation was so far from the truth that Thomas struggled to find words to respond. "Your Honor," he finally managed to say, "I am not a fraud. I serve my country honorably. I bled for this nation. I watched good men die defending freedom, and I will not stand here and allow their memory to be dishonored by accusations that I made up stories about our service. Morrison leaned forward, his eyes flashing with anger. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to stop you right there. This court will not be used as a platform for unsubstantiated claims about military service. The Veterans Administration has clearly stated that there is no record of the medals you claim to have received. Their word carries significant weight with this court, far more weight than the word of someone who appears to be suffering from age-related memory issues or worse, someone who is deliberately attempting to defraud the system. The courtroom had fallen completely silent now. Thomas could feel the weight of every stare, the judgment of strangers who were witnessing what felt like the complete destruction of his honor and dignity. He had faced enemy fire in the jungles of Vietnam, had held dying friends in his arms, had carried the physical and emotional scars of combat for 50 years. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, standing in an American courtroom while a judge systematically destroyed everything he held dear about his service to his country. Morrison continued his verbal assault with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real adversity. Furthermore, Mr. Mitchell, I find your behavior in this courtroom to be disrespectful to the memory of those who actually did serve with distinction. By attempting to claim medals and recognition that you did not earn, you dishonor the genuine heroes who made real sacrifices for this nation. Thomas gripped the edge of the table to keep himself upright. The judge's words were designed to wound, and they were finding their mark with devastating accuracy. Every accusation felt like another nail in the coffin of his reputation, another brick in the wall that was being built between him and the benefits he desperately needed to survive his golden years with dignity. This case is dismissed, Morrison declared, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Thomas's soul. Mr. Mitchell, I suggest you seek appropriate medical attention for what appears to be a serious case of false memory syndrome. This court will not tolerate fraud, regardless of the age or claimed background of the person attempting to perpetrate it. As the judge prepared to move on to the next case, Thomas remained standing at the plaintiff's table, his manila folder still clutched in his hands. The documents inside represented more than just paperwork. They were the physical proof of the most defining moments of his life. The Bronze Star citation described how he had exposed himself to enemy fire to drag a wounded teammate to safety. The Purple Heart documentation detailed the injuries he had sustained when enemy mortars had struck his position during a night patrol. The Medal of Valor recognized his actions during a firefight that had lasted 18 hours and cost the lives of 3 men in his unit. These weren't stories he had imagined or borrowed from movies. They were seared into his memory with the kind of clarity that only comes from experiencing genuine trauma and genuine heroism. The scars on his body told the same story as the documents in his folder, but apparently, that wasn't enough for Judge Morrison or the bureaucrats at the Veterans Administration. The dismissal of his case felt like a death sentence to Thomas Mitchell. As other plaintiffs were called forward for their cases, he remained frozen at the table, unable to comprehend how quickly his world had collapsed. The manila folder in his hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, weighted down with the burden of a lifetime of service that had just been declared worthless by a man in black robes who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Behind him, Thomas could hear the whispered conversations of other people waiting for their cases to be called. Some voices carried sympathy, but others held the kind of skeptical murmurs that suggested they believed the judge's assessment. The possibility that strangers might think he was a fraud or a mentally confused old man made Thomas's chest tighten with shame and rage. He thought about his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. She had been his rock through all the difficult years following his return from Vietnam, helping him navigate the nightmares and the survivor's guilt that had plagued him for decades. Margaret had always believed in him, had always supported his efforts to get the recognition and benefits he deserved from the VA. If she were alive today, Thomas knew she would be furious at what had just transpired in this courtroom. Margaret had been there during the worst periods of his post-war adjustment. She had held him during the night terrors that would strike without warning, sending him back to the jungle where the smell of cordite and blood seemed as real as the bedroom they shared. She had encouraged him to seek counseling when the flashbacks became too frequent, and she had stood by him when he finally began to open up about the things he had seen and done during his tours in Vietnam. More than anyone else, Margaret had understood the cost of his service. She had watched him struggle with chronic pain from his combat injuries, had seen him push through bad days when his arthritis made simple tasks feel impossible. When he had first applied for disability benefits, she had helped him gather documents and prepare his case, believing as he did that the country they both loved would honor its commitments to its veterans. Now, sitting in the courtroom where his honor had just been publicly questioned, Thomas wondered what Margaret would think about the man he had become. Had he really allowed age and pain to cloud his memory? Was it possible that the medals he remembered earning were somehow the product of a confused mind trying to make sense of traumatic experiences? The doubt crept in like poison, undermining 50 years of certainty about the most important events of his life. Thomas tried to push the thoughts away, but Judge Morrison's words echoed in his mind. False memory syndrome, fraud, age-related memory issues. Each phrase was like a dagger to his sense of self-worth, challenging not just his claims about his military service, but his fundamental understanding of who he was as a person. As the morning wore on, Thomas listened to the other cases being heard in the small claims court. A woman seeking compensation for a botched home repair job was awarded damages after presenting receipts and photographs of the substandard work. A man claiming that a used car dealer had sold him a vehicle with undisclosed problems won his case based on testimony from a mechanic who had examined the car. In each instance, Judge Morrison carefully weighed the evidence presented and made reasoned decisions based on the facts before him. The contrast with his own case was stark and painful. These ordinary citizens with their mundane disputes had been treated with respect and given fair hearings. Thomas, a man who had volunteered to serve his country in wartime and had paid a physical and emotional price for that service, had been dismissed as a fraud without any serious consideration of his evidence. During a brief recess, Thomas approached the bailiff, a middle-aged man named Rodriguez who had served in the Gulf War. Rodriguez had the bearing of a career military man, and Thomas hoped he might find some sympathy from a fellow veteran. "Excuse me," Thomas said quietly. "Could I ask you something?" Rodriguez looked at him with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Sure, what can I do for you?" "You heard what happened with my case," Thomas said. "Do you really think I'm making this up? Do I look like someone who would lie about his military service?" The bailiff glanced around to make sure Judge Morrison was out of earshot before responding. "Look, Mr. Mitchell, I've been working in this courthouse for 12 years. I've seen Judge Morrison handle hundreds of cases, and he's generally a fair man. But when it comes to military-related issues, he can be pretty skeptical. His nephew claimed to have PTSD from Iraq to avoid a DUI conviction. Turned out the kid had never even deployed. Ever since then, Morrison's been suspicious of veterans' claims." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. His case had been prejudiced from the beginning by the actions of someone he had never met, someone whose fraudulent claims had poisoned the well for legitimate veterans seeking justice. The irony was bitter and profound. He was being accused of fraud because someone else had actually committed fraud. "That's not right," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't judge all veterans based on the actions of one person." Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. "I know it's not right, but that's the reality you're dealing with. Morrison's made up his mind about these kinds of cases before they even start. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is." The bailiff's honesty was both devastating and oddly comforting. At least Thomas now understood why his carefully prepared evidence had been dismissed so quickly. Judge Morrison hadn't been evaluating his case on its merits. He had been operating from a predetermined assumption that any veteran seeking recognition for combat service was probably lying. As the court session resumed, Thomas found himself studying Morrison more closely. The judge was clearly intelligent and articulate, handling the routine cases with efficiency and apparent fairness. But there was something cold and rigid about his demeanor, a lack of empathy that suggested he had never experienced the kind of desperate circumstances that might drive someone to seek help from a small claims court. Thomas wondered about Morrison's background. Had he ever served in the military? Had he ever faced life-threatening danger in service to his country? Had he ever been forced to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for himself and his comrades? Something in the judge's dismissive attitude suggested that he had lived a life insulated from the harsh realities that shaped the experiences of men like Thomas. The more Thomas thought about it, the more his anger began to override his despair. It was one thing to be denied benefits due to bureaucratic inefficiency or lost paperwork. It was another thing entirely to be publicly branded as a fraud by someone who had apparently never risked anything more dangerous than a paper cut. The injustice of it burned in Thomas's chest like acid, fueling a rage that he hadn't felt since his days in Vietnam. During another brief recess, Thomas stepped outside the courtroom to get some fresh air and try to collect his thoughts. The courthouse steps were busy with people coming and going, lawyers hustling between hearings, and clerks rushing to file paperwork before deadlines. The normal business of the justice system continued around him, but Thomas felt disconnected from it all, like a ghost haunting a world where he no longer belonged. He thought about the men he had served with in Vietnam, particularly his squad leader, Sergeant First Class James Washington. Washington had been a career soldier, a man who embodied everything that was best about military service. He had been tough but fair, demanding excellence from his men while never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Washington had recommended Thomas for his first Purple Heart after Thomas had been wounded while helping to evacuate casualties from a mortar attack. Washington had been killed 3 weeks before Thomas's second tour ended, cut down by a sniper while leading a patrol through a village near the Cambodian border. Thomas had been there when it happened, had held his sergeant as he died, had promised him that he would never forget the lessons Washington had taught him about duty, honor, and service above self. Now, standing on the courthouse steps 50 years later, Thomas felt like he was betraying that promise. By allowing Judge Morrison to brand him a fraud without fighting back, was he dishonoring the memory of men like Washington who had died believing in the principles that Thomas was supposed to represent? The thought galvanized him. Thomas realized that this wasn't just about his disability benefits or his personal financial situation. This was about the integrity of military service itself. If veterans could be casually dismissed as frauds by judges who had never worn a uniform, then what message did that send to young people considering military service? What did it say about America's commitment to the people who volunteered to defend it? When court reconvened, Thomas noticed that several new people had entered the gallery. Among them was an elderly woman who seemed to be observing the proceedings with particular interest. She was well-dressed and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that suggested she was accustomed to being in positions of authority. Something about her presence made Thomas feel slightly less alone in the courtroom. As the afternoon cases proceeded, Thomas began to formulate a plan. He would not accept Judge Morrison's dismissal as the final word on his service or his character. There had to be other avenues for appeal, other ways to present his case to people who might be more receptive to the evidence he could provide. He would contact veteran service organizations, write letters to his congressional representatives, and, if necessary, find a way to hire a lawyer who specialized in military cases. The plan gave him a sense of purpose that helped to counteract the crushing despair he had felt earlier. Thomas had not survived 2 tours of Vietnam and 40 years of post-war struggles just to give up when faced with the prejudice of one biased judge. He had been trained to complete the mission, no matter how difficult or dangerous, and this mission, to vindicate his service and secure the benefits he had earned, was one that he intended to see through to the end. As the court session neared its end, Thomas gathered his paperwork and prepared to leave. He had accomplished nothing that day except to confirm that the justice system, like so many other institutions, could be corrupted by the biases and limitations of the people who operated it. But He had also learned something important about himself. He was not ready to surrender, not ready to accept the judgment of people who had never faced the challenges he had overcome. Walking slowly toward the exit, Thomas felt a hand touch his shoulder gently. He turned to see the elderly woman who had been observing from the gallery. Up close, she appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to convey both sympathy and determination. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you Thomas Mitchell?" "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied, wondering how she knew his name. "I'm Eleanor Washington," she said, and Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "My late husband was Sergeant First Class James Washington. I believe you served with him in Vietnam." The coincidence was so extraordinary that Thomas initially wondered if he was dreaming. Eleanor Washington, the widow of the man who had been his mentor and friend, had somehow found her way to the same courtroom where his honor was being challenged. The universe, it seemed, still held the capacity for miracles. "Mrs. Washington," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "your husband saved my life more than once. He was the finest soldier I ever knew." Eleanor smiled, but there was steel in her expression. "James wrote to me about you in several of his letters home. He mentioned your Bronze Star action specifically, how you risked your life to save a wounded teammate. He was very proud to serve with you." The validation hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. Here was independent confirmation of one of the actions that Judge Morrison had dismissed as a fantasy. James Washington's letters home had documented Thomas's heroism in real time, 50 years before anyone had thought to question it. "Mrs. Washington," Thomas said urgently, "would you be willing to testify about those letters? Would you help me prove that my service was real?" Eleanor's smile became fiercer. "Mr. Mitchell, I didn't drive 2 hours to get here just to offer my condolences. I've been following your case, and I have something that might interest you. My husband kept copies of several official reports he filed recommending you and other soldiers for decorations. Those reports are now in the possession of someone who has been very interested in your situation." She gestured toward the back of the courtroom, where a figure had been sitting quietly in the shadows. As the person rose and began walking toward them, Thomas squinted in the dim light, trying to make out who it might be. As the figure approached from the back of the courtroom, Thomas felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with disbelief. The person moved with a measured stride that spoke of military bearing, and there was something about the way others in the courtroom unconsciously straightened their posture as the individual passed that suggested this was someone accustomed to command. The man who emerged from the shadows was tall and distinguished, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of ramrod-straight posture that never quite leaves a career military officer. His civilian clothes were impeccably tailored, but there was something about his bearing that screamed military service to anyone who knew what to look for. Thomas noticed immediately that several other veterans in the courtroom had unconsciously come to attention when they saw him. "Mr. Mitchell," Eleanor Washington said, her voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction, "I'd like you to meet Brigadier General David Harrison, United States Army, retired." Thomas felt his knees go weak. A general, a real, honest-to-God general had somehow materialized in this small claims courtroom where his honor had just been dragged through the mud. The coincidence was so improbable that Thomas briefly wondered if he was hallucinating, if the stress of the morning's proceedings had finally caused his mind to snap. General Harrison extended his hand with the kind of firm grip that conveyed both respect and authority. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, using Thomas's military rank rather than the civilian title the court had employed, "it's an honor to finally meet you." The use of his military rank hit Thomas like an emotional sledgehammer. For the first time in hours, someone was acknowledging his service rather than questioning it. The simple gesture of respect from a senior officer meant more to Thomas than any words of comfort or sympathy could have provided. "Sir," Thomas managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't understand what's happening here." Harrison's expression was grim but determined. "Sergeant Mitchell, Mrs. Washington contacted me several weeks ago after reading about your case in a veteran's newsletter. She had been trying to track you down for years to share some information that she thought you deserved to know. Eleanor Washington stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio that Thomas hadn't noticed she was carrying. Mr. Mitchell, when my husband was killed in Vietnam, the Army returned his personal effects to me. Among them were copies of several official reports he had filed recommending soldiers in his unit for decorations. Your name appeared in 3 separate documents. She handed Thomas a manila envelope that was yellowed with age, but appeared to be in remarkably good condition. With trembling hands, Thomas opened the envelope and began reading the first document. It was a carbon copy of an official Army report, typed on letterhead from the 1st Infantry Division and dated 3 months before Sergeant Washington's death. The report detailed an action that Thomas remembered with crystalline clarity. His unit had been conducting a routine patrol when they had stumbled into a well-planned ambush. Enemy fire had pinned them down in an exposed position, and several soldiers had been wounded in the initial burst of gunfire. Without thinking about his own safety, Thomas had exposed himself to enemy fire to drag 2 wounded teammates to cover, then had provided suppressing fire that allowed the rest of the unit to maneuver out of the kill zone. Reading Sergeant Washington's detailed account of that action, Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in the recognition from a man he had respected above all others. Grief for the friends who had been wounded that day, one of whom had died later despite Thomas's efforts to save him. And a burning anger at the people who had dismissed this documented heroism as the fantasy of a confused old man. "Sir," Thomas said to General Harrison, "how did you get involved in this?" Harrison's expression grew even more serious. "Sergeant Mitchell, I've spent the last 30 years of my career working with Veterans Affairs in various capacities. I've seen too many good soldiers get lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, their service forgotten or minimized by people who never had the courage to put on a uniform. When Mrs. Washington contacted me with evidence that a decorated combat veteran was being denied benefits because of lost paperwork, I made it my personal mission to set the record straight." The general gestured toward the front of the courtroom, where Judge Morrison was wrapping up the day's final case. "What happened here today is not just an injustice to you personally, Sergeant Mitchell. It's a betrayal of every principle that our military justice system is supposed to represent. When a civilian court can casually dismiss the documented service of a combat veteran without bothering to examine the evidence, we've lost something fundamental about what it means to honor military service." Thomas looked around the courtroom, which was beginning to empty as the day's proceedings came to an end. Other people were gathering their belongings and preparing to leave, most of them probably unaware that they had just witnessed a miscarriage of justice that went far beyond the typical disputes handled in small claims court. "General," Thomas said quietly, "what can we do about this? The judge has already dismissed my case. He called me a fraud in front of everyone." Harrison's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "Sergeant Mitchell, what Judge Morrison doesn't understand is that military service creates obligations that extend far beyond the courtroom. When he dismissed your case without examining the evidence, he didn't just insult you personally. He insulted every soldier who ever served under your command, every officer who ever recommended you for recognition, and every taxpayer who expects their government to honor its commitments to veterans." Eleanor Washington had been listening to this exchange with growing satisfaction. Now she stepped forward again, her expression carrying the kind of maternal fierceness that suggested she was prepared to take on the entire justice system if necessary. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "there's something else you need to know. My husband's letters home mentioned you frequently, but there was one letter in particular that I think you'll find interesting. He wrote it just 3 days before he was killed, and in it he specifically mentioned that he was recommending you for a Medal of Valor for actions you took during a firefight that lasted most of a night." She handed Thomas another document, this one a handwritten letter on Army stationery. The familiar handwriting brought back a flood of memories of Sergeant Washington, who had always been meticulous about his paperwork and had insisted that his men maintain detailed records of their actions in the field. Thomas read the letter with growing amazement. Washington had described in vivid detail the 18-hour firefight that had earned Thomas his Medal of Valor, including specific instances of leadership under fire that Thomas had never known his sergeant had witnessed. The letter painted a picture of a soldier who had repeatedly risked his life to protect his comrades, who had demonstrated tactical brilliance under extreme pressure, and who had embodied the highest traditions of the United States Army. He wrote this 3 days before he died. Eleanor said softly. He never had a chance to file the official recommendation, but his intent was clear. You earned that Medal of Valor, Mr. Mitchell, and my husband knew it. General Harrison took the letter and read it carefully, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked up at Thomas with something approaching awe. Sergeant Mitchell, the general said formally, on behalf of the United States Army and every soldier who has ever worn a uniform, I want to apologize for what happened to you today. What this letter describes is the kind of heroism that defines the very best of military service. The fact that you've been forced to defend these actions in a civilian courtroom is a disgrace to our entire system. Thomas felt tears beginning to well up in his eyes, but for the first time all day, they were tears of relief rather than shame. After hours of having his service questioned and his character attacked, he was finally in the presence of people who understood what military service meant and who were prepared to honor it appropriately. What do we do now? Thomas asked, looking back and forth between the general and Mrs. Washington. Harrison's expression became grimly determined. Now, Sergeant Mitchell, we take this case where it belongs. Federal court has jurisdiction over Veterans Affairs, and I happen to know several federal judges who understand the importance of honoring military service. But more importantly, we're going to make sure that Judge Morrison understands the magnitude of the mistake he made today. The general looked toward the front of the courtroom, where Judge Morrison was gathering his papers and preparing to leave for the day. Morrison seemed completely unaware of the drama that was unfolding just a few feet away, apparently satisfied that he had efficiently disposed of another frivolous lawsuit. Your Honor, General Harrison called out, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that made everyone in the courtroom stop what they were doing and pay attention. Judge Morrison looked up from his paperwork with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being addressed in his own courtroom by someone he didn't recognize. When he saw the distinguished gentleman approaching the bench with obvious purpose, his expression shifted from annoyance to uncertainty. "Excuse me," Morrison said, his tone carrying a note of defensive irritation. "Court is adjourned for the day. If you have business here, you'll need to file the appropriate paperwork with the clerk." Harrison continued walking toward the bench with measured steps, his bearing radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of command responsibility. Behind him, Thomas and Eleanor Washington followed, with Eleanor still carrying the portfolio of documents that could vindicate Thomas's claims. "Judge Morrison," Harrison said, his voice carrying easily throughout the courtroom, "I am Brigadier General David Harrison, United States Army, retired. I'm here regarding the case you just dismissed involving Sergeant Thomas Mitchell's military service." The title General seemed to have a physical impact on Judge Morrison, who straightened unconsciously in his chair. Thomas noticed that the few remaining people in the courtroom had stopped their conversations to listen to what was clearly shaping up to be an extraordinary confrontation. Morrison's expression grew guarded. "General, as I said, court is adjourned. If you have concerns about a case, the proper procedure is to file an appeal through the appropriate channels." Harrison stopped directly in front of the bench, his posture ramrod straight, and his expression carrying the kind of controlled intensity that suggested he was operating under a full head of steam. When he spoke, his voice carried throughout the courtroom with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having his words carry life and death consequences. "Judge Morrison," Harrison said evenly, "before you leave this courtroom today, there are some things you need to understand about the case you just dismissed." Judge Morrison froze in his chair, his papers forgotten as General Harrison's commanding presence filled the courtroom. The authority in the general's voice was unmistakable, carrying the weight of decades spent making decisions that affected the lives and deaths of soldiers. Even the court clerk and bailiff had stopped their end-of-day routines to watch the confrontation that was unfolding before them. General Morrison said, his voice noticeably less confident than it had been when dismissing Thomas's case, "I appreciate your service to our country, but this court operates under civilian authority. Military rank doesn't supersede judicial process." Harrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that Judge Morrison had just made a serious tactical error. "Judge Morrison, I'm not here to challenge your judicial authority. I'm here to provide you with evidence that will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that you have just committed a grave injustice against a decorated combat veteran." The general gestured to Eleanor Washington, who stepped forward with her portfolio of documents. The courtroom had become completely silent now, with everyone present sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had spent 50 years honoring her husband's memory. "I am Eleanor Washington, widow of Sergeant First Class James Washington, who was killed in Vietnam in 1969. I have in my possession original military documents that prove beyond any doubt that Sergeant Thomas Mitchell earned every decoration he claimed in this courtroom today." She opened the portfolio and began laying out documents on the plaintiff's table where Thomas had stood just hours earlier. Carbon copies of official reports, handwritten letters, and photocopied orders began to accumulate in neat piles, each one representing a piece of evidence that Judge Morrison had refused to consider. "Mrs. Washington," Morrison said, his tone becoming more cautious, "I understand that you believe these documents are authentic, but, as I explained to Mr. Mitchell, photocopied materials can be easily fabricated." General Harrison stepped forward, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a sword. "Judge Morrison, what Mrs. Washington is showing you are not fabricated documents. They are original carbon copies of official U.S. Army reports filed by Sergeant First Class Washington, who served as Sergeant Mitchell's squad leader in Vietnam. These documents were created in 1969, 50 years before anyone had any reason to question Sergeant Mitchell's service record." The general picked up one of the documents and held it out toward the judge. This particular report details an action in which Sergeant Mitchell exposed himself to enemy fire to rescue 2 wounded soldiers, then provided covering fire that allowed his entire unit to escape from an ambush. The action earned him a Bronze Star for valor, which your court dismissed as a fantasy created by an aging mind. Morrison's face had grown noticeably paler as the implications of what he was hearing began to sink in. If these documents were authentic, then he had just publicly accused a genuine war hero of fraud and mental incompetence. The potential consequences of such a mistake were beginning to dawn on him. "General," Morrison said carefully, "how do I know these documents are authentic? Anyone with access to military letterhead could create similar paperwork." Harrison's smile was cold and professional. "Judge Morrison, I've spent 30 years working with military records. I can authenticate these documents in several ways. First, the carbon paper used in these copies hasn't been manufactured since 1975, and the slight discoloration pattern is consistent with documents that are actually 50 years old. Second, the military administrative procedures referenced in these reports were classified information in 1969, known only to personnel who actually served in Vietnam during that time period." The general paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. "But, most importantly, Judge Morrison, these documents contain details about specific military operations that were classified for 30 years after they occurred. The geographic coordinates, unit designations, and tactical procedures mentioned in these reports were not available to the general public until the Army declassified them in 1999. No civilian could have fabricated these documents because no civilian had access to the information they contain." Thomas watched as Judge Morrison's confident demeanor began to crumble. The man who had so casually dismissed his claims just hours earlier was now confronted with evidence that he had made a serious error in judgment. The irony was not lost on Thomas that Morrison was now in the position of having his competence questioned by people with superior knowledge and authority. Eleanor Washington stepped forward again, carrying another document that she had saved for last. "Judge Morrison, there's one more thing I think you should see. This is a letter my husband wrote to me 3 days before he was killed. In it, he specifically mentions his intention to recommend Sergeant Mitchell for a Medal of Valor for actions taken during an 18-hour firefight." She handed the letter to General Harrison, who read it aloud with the formal precision of someone delivering an official military citation. Quote, "Eleanor, I need to tell you about something incredible that happened during our last patrol. We got pinned down by a large enemy force, and for 18 hours we were in a running firefight that could have gone either way. Tom Mitchell kept our squad together through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. He repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to help wounded men, and his leadership probably saved the lives of every soldier in our unit. I'm recommending him for a Medal of Valor as soon as we get back to base." The general looked up from the letter, his expression grave. "Sergeant First Class Washington never made it back to base, Judge Morrison. He was killed in action before he could file that recommendation. But his intent was clear, and his assessment was based on direct observation of combat actions that you dismiss today as the fantasies of a confused old man." Morrison had gone completely silent now, apparently realizing that he was trapped in a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. The evidence being presented was not just convincing, it was overwhelming. More importantly, it was being presented by people whose credibility and expertise far exceeded his own when it came to matters of military service. "Your Honor," General Harrison continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "I want you to understand the full implications of what happened in this courtroom today. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell is not just any veteran. He is a decorated combat soldier who voluntarily extended his service in Vietnam, who was wounded multiple times in action, and who demonstrated the kind of heroism that represents the very best of American military tradition." The general's voice grew harder as he continued. "When you dismissed his case without examining the evidence, you didn't just insult one man. You insulted every soldier who ever served under fire, every family who lost a loved one in military service, and every American who expects their government to honor its commitments to veterans." Thomas felt a surge of emotion as he listened to General Harrison defend his service with the kind of passion and authority that he had never been able to muster for himself. After years of being treated as a supplicant by VA bureaucrats and being dismissed as a potential fraud by Judge Morrison, it was profoundly moving to hear his service described in terms that matched his own understanding of what he had given to his country. Morrison finally found his voice, though it lacked the confidence that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. "General, I base my decision on the information provided by the Veterans Administration. They stated clearly that there was no record of the medals in question." Harrison's expression became even grimmer. "Judge Morrison, the Veterans Administration has been experiencing significant problems with lost records, particularly from the Vietnam era. A fire at the National Personnel Records Center in 1973 destroyed millions of military files. The fact that the VA can't find documentation of Sergeant Mitchell's medals doesn't mean the medals were never awarded. It means the documentation was lost in a bureaucratic disaster that occurred 50 years ago." The general stepped closer to the bench, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow carried more menace than his earlier formal pronouncements. "What concerns me most, Judge Morrison, is that you didn't bother to investigate these possibilities before accusing a combat veteran of fraud. You took the word of bureaucrats who admitted they had no records, and you used that absence of evidence to attack the character and mental competence of a man who bled for this country." Eleanor Washington had been watching this exchange with growing satisfaction, but now she stepped forward with one final piece of evidence. "Judge Morrison, there's something else you should know. After my husband's death, I received a letter from his commanding officer, Colonel Robert Hayes. In that letter, Colonel Hayes specifically mentioned the medals that several soldiers in my husband's unit had earned, including Sergeant Mitchell's decorations. She handed another document to General Harrison, who scanned it quickly before addressing the court. Judge Morrison, this letter from Colonel Hayes, dated 6 weeks after Sergeant Washington's death, specifically states that Sergeant Mitchell was one of the most decorated soldiers in the battalion, having earned a Bronze Star, 3 Purple Hearts, and a Medal of Valor during his tours in Vietnam. Harrison looked directly at Judge Morrison, his expression carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. Your Honor, you are now in possession of 3 independent sources of documentation, created by 3 different officers over a period of several months, all confirming that Sergeant Mitchell earned the decorations he claimed in your courtroom today. These are not the fantasies of a confused mind. They are the documented observations of professional soldiers who served with distinction in combat. The courtroom had remained completely silent throughout this presentation of evidence. Thomas could see that even the court personnel were stunned by the revelations that were undermining everything Judge Morrison had said during the dismissal of his case. Morrison sat in his chair like a man who had just realized he had stepped on a landmine. The evidence being presented wasn't just compelling, it was irrefutable. More importantly, it was being presented by people whose credibility and expertise made his own hasty judgment look foolish and prejudiced. General, Morrison said slowly, what are you asking me to do? Harrison's expression remained implacable. Judge Morrison, I'm asking you to do what you should have done this morning. Examine the evidence before making a judgment. Sergeant Mitchell came to your courtroom seeking justice, and instead of receiving a fair hearing, he was subjected to accusations and insults that no American veteran should ever have to endure. The general gestured toward Thomas, who was standing nearby with tears streaming down his face. Look at that man, Judge Morrison. Look at what your words did to him. He has carried the scars of combat for 50 years, and today you added new wounds that may never heal. You attacked his honor, questioned his mental competence, and dismissed his service as fraudulent, all without bothering to examine evidence that any competent investigator would have found compelling. Harrison's voice grew more passionate as he continued. This is not just about one court case, Judge Morrison. This is about the fundamental principle that military service means something in this country. When veterans can be casually dismissed as frauds by judges who have never worn a uniform, we've lost something essential about what it means to be American. Judge Morrison looked around the courtroom, finally, seeming to grasp the magnitude of what had transpired. The confident administrator who had dismissed Thomas's case with casual cruelty was gone, replaced by a man who was beginning to understand that he had made a career-defining mistake. General Harrison, Morrison said quietly, Mrs. Washington, Sergeant Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I clearly made an error in judgment today, and I regret any pain that my words may have caused. But General Harrison wasn't finished. His voice took on the tone of someone delivering a formal military briefing, clinical and precise. Judge Morrison, your apology is noted, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue. Sergeant Mitchell came to this court seeking redress for an injustice, and instead of receiving justice, he was subjected to a public attack on his character and service. An apology doesn't undo that damage. Harrison paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. However, there is something you can do to begin making this right. You have the authority to reopen Sergeant Mitchell's case and to order the Veterans Administration to properly review his claims based on the evidence that has been presented today. You can also ensure that this court never again dismisses a veteran's claims without proper investigation. Thomas found his voice for the first time since the general's arrival. Your Honor, he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day, I don't want your apology. I want what I came here for, recognition that my service was real, that my sacrifices meant something, and that the government has an obligation to honor its promises to veterans. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, seeming to understand that he was being given an opportunity to transform a devastating mistake into a meaningful act of justice. Sergeant Mitchell, I will reopen your case immediately. And, General Harrison, I give you my word that this court will implement new procedures to ensure that veterans' claims receive the respectful consideration they deserve. As the confrontation in the courtroom began to wind down, Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that his honor had been vindicated, gratitude toward the people who had stepped forward to defend him, and a deep sadness for all the veterans who had faced similar challenges without having a general appear to champion their cause. General Harrison approached Thomas and extended his hand once more. "Sergeant Mitchell, it has been an honor to serve with you today. Your service to this country will not be forgotten or diminished by the ignorance of people who have never faced the challenges you've overcome." Thomas gripped the general's hand firmly, feeling for the first time in years that he was truly among people who understood the full meaning of military service. "Sir," he said, "thank you for giving me back my honor." Eleanor Washington stepped forward and embraced Thomas gently. "Mr. Mitchell, my husband would be proud of how you conducted yourself today. He always said that the measure of a soldier wasn't how he performed when things were easy, but how he stood up when everything seemed lost." As they prepared to leave the courtroom, Judge Morrison called out one final time. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a humility that had been absent earlier, "thank you for your service to our country. I hope that what happened here today will serve as a reminder to all of us about the debt we owe to our veterans." Thomas turned back toward the bench, seeing Judge Morrison not as an enemy now, but as a man who had learned an important lesson about the cost of prejudice and the importance of seeking truth before rendering judgment. "Your Honor," Thomas said simply, "just remember this day the next time a veteran comes before your court seeking justice." As they walked out of the courtroom together, Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he had been carrying. His long battle for recognition was not over, but for the first time in years, he felt confident that justice would eventually prevail. More importantly, he had been reminded that there were still people in the world who understood the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and honor. The late afternoon sun was shining as they emerged from the courthouse, and Thomas realized that this day, which had begun as one of the darkest of his life, had somehow transformed into a victory not just for him personally, but for every veteran who had ever been forced to defend the reality of their service to an indifferent bureaucracy. General Harrison paused on the courthouse steps and looked back at the building where justice had very nearly miscarried. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said thoughtfully, "today's events will be reported through military channels. I suspect that other veterans who have faced similar challenges will soon have advocates in their corner as well." Thomas smiled for the first time in months, realizing that his personal victory might somehow help other veterans who were fighting the same battles he had faced. If that was true, then perhaps all the pain and frustration of the past few years had served a larger purpose. As they walked away from the courthouse, Thomas carried himself with the bearing of a soldier who had completed a successful mission. His honor had been tested and vindicated, his service had been recognized by people who understood its true value, and his faith in the possibility of justice had been restored. For a 72-year-old veteran who had begun the day facing accusations of fraud, that was victory enough for any campaign.